Okay, cool. So we've talked about what is a population. We've talked about how do we quantify populations. We've talked about examining populations across scales, either at the metapopulation scale, at the landscape sort of geographic distribution scale, at the local disbursement scale, whether things are patchy or evenly dispersed. And now I want to talk a little bit about range shifts, right? So we covered this thing about anthropogenic change in terms of fragmentation and how high fragmentation can cause extirpation, local extinction, and if we have extirpation in enough of the meta communities, we could have sort of a species range moved by extinction, right? Local extinction, extirpation. But climate change is also a major factor impacting population persistence in our world. And your book does a really cool example walking you through some of the key ideas here. And so, the world's getting warmer, right? The climate is changing in lots of different ways, but the world is generally getting warmer. And we know that many species range limits are limited by abiotic suitability, right? We talked about this, abiotic habitat suitability. And one really clear example of this is, I think it's called the long-spined, I should get the common name, long-spined sea urchin, Centrostephanus rogersi. And this is a species of sea urchin whose range is limited to lower latitudes in Australia and Tasmania, right? So if we imagine Australia, it's even worse than me trying to draw Florida in America, and Tasmania, right? We have a sea urchin who lived up here, right? And this spectacular evidence shows that as waters have warmed along the coast of Tasmania, there's a little island right here. This sea urchin was present in the 1960s, right on this North Island. And then as water warmed, this sea urchin made its way around southward to colder habitats, but are now warming because of climate, eventually reaching this population in 2005, right? And so this is really interesting and highlights one really important fact, which is that the adults aren't limited by the temperature of the water in the southern part of Tasmania, right? The adults aren't limited, but rather the larvae of the sea urchin fail to develop below 12 degrees Celsius. If you look at the plot in your book, it has water temperatures in Tasmania since 1960, and just about in the early 1990s, they crossed that 12-degree threshold. And there's some noise around this data, right? Of course, it's very noisy. But once sea temperatures cross that threshold, then the larval stage of this sea urchin is able to develop successfully and populations can establish, right? And what's crazy about this is it has extraordinarily long-reaching consequences in the cases of sea urchins, right? Where they build, if you read the case study starting in the beginning of your chapter, they build these barrens where many sea urchins sort of deforest kelp forests. And so we can see some species shifting their ranges poleward, away from the equator, to colder habitats as the climate warms, and this is one really clear case. The species that are in those locations, as the new species move poleward, may be highly stressed because abiotic conditions are changing, or they may just be encountering new interactions. They may be encountering herbivores, in the case of these urchins, that weren't there before and can dramatically shape the ecosystem. And so there can be these very clear cascading effects of climate change on range shifts. So climate change is changing geographic ranges. With cascading effects. The other thing that's happening, so this is one thing populations can do, is they can migrate, right? We can have range shifts where things are moving away from the equator and moving poleward, either to the South Pole or the North Pole. But the other thing that's happening pretty dramatically are range constrictions, right? So for example, the bumblebees that I study are showing severe range constrictions, where at the southern end of their distributions, we're seeing lots of extirpations. They can't handle the high heat, but their range isn't expanding northward. We don't 100% know why, but it seems clear that it's not expanding northward. So in this case, we're seeing a major range contraction, right? There's poleward pressure from the south, and the species can't move north, and so we're seeing a shrinking of the viable range. Does that make sense? A shrinking of the viable range. One other clear sort of range shift thing that is happening is that in alpine habitats, species are moving upslope, right? So we talked about how local geography impacts weather of a place, and we know that increasing altitude is like going up in latitude, right? So going up a mountain, it gets colder, it gets wetter often, depending on how high you go. And so it's like going up in latitude. Not always wetter, that was a mistake to say, but I'm looking at a picture of the Sierras where I'm in the background of my computer shows a very dry meadow and a wet mountain range. Disregard that, up altitude isn't always wetter, but it is almost always colder. And so we're seeing uphill migration of species distributions, right? So you could imagine a species, for example, in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and we have a topographic map here. This is the top, we're moving down. This is a mountain range looking from above, right? And it may have been restricted to this elevational band, right? Because the amount of freezing days are within its range of suitability. Any lower, and it's not frozen enough. Any higher, and it's frozen too much. As the climate is changing, these ranges are shifting upslope, right? These ranges are shifting upslope. And so ranges are not static, right? Just like there's historical contingency and dispersal effects that shape current ranges, the world is changing because of us, and not because of us, but mostly because of us. And that's causing dramatic shifts in range that can have these cascading ecological effects. Nice. So soon we're going to be wrapping up this, but that's the second to last mini lecture, climate change and geographic changes in range. Nice.